Good morning, friends. As we close out another week, let's consider the illustrations that Jesus used in responding to John's disciples from our message this past week. And let's perhaps consider one conclusion we shouldn't come to. Jesus says, "No one puts a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old garment, for the patch tears away from the garment, and a worse tear is made. Neither is new wine put into old wineskins. If it is, the skins burst, and the wine is spilled, and the skins are destroyed. But new wine is put into fresh wineskins, and so both are preserved." Now, one of the dangers of interpreting illustrations is when we start right out looking for symbolism. Sometimes we assume that as soon as we see an illustration or a parable in the scriptures, then it must be heavily laden with symbols. And so in order to understand the point of the teaching, you need to discover what the symbols point to. And while I'm not saying that symbolism doesn't take place in the scriptures, because it certainly does, and very much so at times, we need to be careful not to jump ahead of ourselves. Because while the books of Revelation and Daniel and Isaiah and Ezekiel all contain portions of apocalyptic literature, and therefore portions where symbolism is pretty much everywhere in those sections, we need to remember that apocalyptic literature is a whole genre in its own right. And other genres, like the Gospels and the Epistles, may not behave in quite the same way. For this reason, it is very important for us to interpret and seek to understand illustrations for their own content in their own right before we immediately try to identify what each element of the illustration symbolizes. The reason why I mention this is because in the two illustrations we just read, there is something that both examples have in common, and so are sometimes, or really oftentimes, seen as being symbolic, when really they are just incidental to the whole point. Because in the first case, Jesus compares in opposition an old garment and an unshrunk patch. And another way you could understand that is an old garment and a new patch, which that line of thinking is helped along by seeing that in the second illustration, we have the contrast between old wineskins and new wine. With this in mind, it's easy for someone who is eager to make those quick symbolic connections between the scriptures and their own experience to then go ahead and say, aha, clearly Jesus is saying that old things are bad and new things are good. You shouldn't try to patch an old garment, just throw it out. You shouldn't put new wine into an old wineskin. The old wineskin is just no good. Throw it out and make everything new. At this point, Jesus' teaching seems to indicate that the disciples of John needed to beware of thinking like the Pharisees because that was the old way of thinking. But Jesus is presenting a new way of thinking, and since new things are clearly demonstrated to be better than the old things, well, they needed to let go of the Pharisaical way of thinking and embrace Jesus' way of thinking instead. Now, here's the thing. That logic still gets us to a desirable conclusion, right? Pharisees bad, Jesus good. So everything's all right. We can use that line of thinking with this illustration, that understanding of the symbolism of the old and new, bad and good, because it gets us to the correct basic conclusion, right? Well, actually, no. Because how you get there is incredibly important. Because there's going to be further application. For instance, if we say Pharisees bad, Jesus good, because old is bad, new is good, well, what happens when you apply that to things today? Because from that perspective, Jesus, and according to our, where we are at today, Jesus and his way of thinking is the old way. And any number of other lifestyles and teachings could be plugged into the new way. Jesus' teaching is the teaching of old traditionalism, old Christian values. But old is bad, so get rid of it to make way of new thinking. New thinking could be considered postmodernistic, the rejection of absolute truth, the denial of any one overarching story or meta-narrative that pulls everything together. Instead, everyone gets to define their own reality and so on. Therefore, one, according to this line of thinking, if we maintain this line of thinking, might say that by Jesus' own teaching, you should get rid of his way of thinking and embrace the new way of thinking that has now come along. Now, this might seem absurd to some, but there are absolutely people out there who consider this to be the main point of application in these illustrations. But that only comes out of not taking the time to understand what the illustrations are trying to teach in their own right, rather than just rushing to identify symbols and what they might correspond to in our own experience. Because if we strive to understand Jesus' actual point in the context of his own day and in the circumstances that he's speaking in, we'll see then, as we did on Sunday, that Jesus is simply describing things that, when put together, only result in disaster. Yes, it just so happens that in both cases there's an element of age, but we must be careful not to stretch the details of the illustration farther than they're supposed to go, farther than they're meant to go. These are simply examples of things that ought not be put together, lest disaster result. And the Pharisees' way of thinking shouldn't be combined with the truth that Jesus is bringing, not because they're old and Jesus' truths are new. Actually, nothing could be farther from the truth. As we saw explicitly in the Sermon on the Mount, the truths Jesus was bringing to the people might have been new to them, but they were actually the same truths that has always been in place. He was simply bringing them back to the original teachings of God, which then, of course, made what he was teaching the oldest of teachings. And so the point of Jesus' illustration and the application that comes out of it isn't about old versus new, but rather about the fact that some things cannot and must not be combined with other things, lest that combination actually make the problem worse. Therefore, in the context of what he's talking about at that time, you should not try to mix the legalism of the Pharisees with the truths of grace that Jesus was teaching, because then you're in an even worse situation than before. You might say, well, how could that be? At least then you've got a little bit of the good stuff in there, right? So how could a mixture of good and bad be worse than just being all bad, right? Well, because by mixing in legalism, you're actually distorting the truths that Jesus is teaching, which means they're not going to lead to salvation because you're not actually believing the truth. You're not actually going to submit to Christ. But in addition to that, because Jesus' teachings do seem to be in the mix, or you can convince yourself that his teachings are in the mix, it's so much easier to think that you're doing exactly what you ought to be doing. Therefore, it becomes harder to even see your need for salvation. In this way, a religious legalist, one who claims to be a Christian but who is thoroughly legalistic in their thoughts, a religious legalist is actually in a much worse position than your most hedonistic unbeliever. Okay? Because that unbeliever, when presented with the gospel, might actually look at their lifestyle and say, yeah, I guess I am a sinner. If what I'm hearing is true, I need to be saved. But the religious legalist, having combined together, their own human tradition with what they perceive to be the truths of Christ, is going to not even listen to the gospel because they think they've already been there, already done that. I'm not a sinner, at least not really when it comes down to it. And so they won't even recognize their need, which is obviously a much worse position to be in. So let's be careful how quickly we interpret the illustrations and the metaphorical language that we see in the scripture, and especially be careful as to how quickly we see something that might be symbolic of something in our own experience. Let's make sure we take the time to understand the illustrations and the metaphors in the context of the original audience first, to see what the point was to them, and then we can make the application for us. In any case, I pray you have a good and godly day, and Lord willing, I'll see you Sunday.